Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack one of television's most polarizing and honestly relentlessly debated characters of all time. We all know him, right? A lot of us grew up watching him. And yet, depending on who you ask today, Ross Geller is either the absolute beating heart of Friends or its absolute most frustrating presence. So today, we're not just going to pick a side. We're going to break down the actual evidence. We'll look at the moments that made fans fall in love with him, the decisions that made us all collectively cringe, and figure out whether he truly deserves his controversial reputation. Now, what's really interesting is how perfectly his character's paradox is captured by two massive extremes. On one hand, you have the hopeless romantic, a guy who literally loved the same woman since high school and just never stopped fighting for love. But on the other hand, you have the problematic friend, a guy who makes these deeply frustrating, chaotic decisions that completely sabotage his own happiness. So, is he a dedicated lover, or is he the group's biggest liability? Well, what if both of those seemingly opposite views are actually entirely correct? To really understand his intense need for control, we have to start way back at the beginning. You see, before we even truly get to know Ross in the series, he's already experienced a massive, foundational heartbreak. His wife, Carol, leaves him after realizing she's a lesbian. Suddenly, he is a single father whose entire life plan has been completely upended. We call this the Carol factor. Noting this early trauma really contextualizes his profound insecurities. Now, does it excuse his future behavior? Absolutely not, but it completely explains it. He becomes this person who desperately craves stability, but he's constantly terrified that the rug is going to get pulled out from under him at any given second. And you really see how this anxiety builds when the very thing he's waited for his whole life finally happens: Rachel. They finally get together, but man, the cracks immediately appear. When Rachel enters the fashion industry and meets her coworker Mark, Ross's deep-seated anxiety completely overrides his trust. Even though Rachel repeatedly insists that Mark is just a coworker, Ross instantly assumes the worst. He sends these over-the-top gifts to her office, physically interrupts her work, and fundamentally struggles to respect the independence she's trying so hard to build. He just lets his fear totally dictate his actions. This deep-seated insecurity inevitably boils over into one of the most famous arguments in sitcom history. Come on, you already know the line. After a massive, heated fight fueled by this exact jealousy, Rachel suggests they take a break. Hurt, overwhelmed, and completely reactionary, Ross spends that very same night with Chloe from the copy place. It's a moment that sparked a pop culture firestorm that, let's be honest, is still burning bright today. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the debate has raged for decades. Looking at the sheer technicalities, many argue Ross was right. The relationship was legally on pause, so he didn't technically cheat. But looking at the other side of the coin, being legally right about your relationship status doesn't necessarily mean you're acting with emotional maturity or respect, right? Sleeping with someone else mere hours after a painful fight shows a staggering lack of emotional responsibility. The show never settles this debate, and that's because the real issue was never about definitions. It was always about trust. Being technically correct just doesn't automatically make you morally right. But his need for certainty and control isn't just limited to romance. It bleeds deeply into his everyday friendships too. He frequently struggles when things don't happen exactly according to his expectations. I mean, as an incredibly intelligent paleontologist, he often crosses the line straight into being an arrogant know-it-all. He corrects his friends unnecessarily, he argues over incredibly trivial details, and time again, he prioritizes winning an argument over understanding someone else's feelings. He just simply has to be right. His need for traditional expectations also bled into gender roles. We see this in episodes where he totally panics over his son Ben playing with a Barbie doll, or his extreme discomfort with a male nanny caring for Emma. Now, viewed through a modern lens, these moments feel very outdated. However, it's really vital to recognize the framing here. The show actively used these moments to mock Ross's irrational fears rather than endorse them. His friends constantly challenge his assumptions, and the punchline is almost always Ross realizing just how ridiculous his rigidity actually is. Yet, the absolute crucial point here is that this exact same rigid perfectionism birthed some of the most high-energy, iconic comedic moments in the entire series. Think about it for a second. The disastrous, miscounted spray tan, the aggressively whitening teeth that literally glowed in the dark, the leather pants that completely refused to go back on during a date, the wildly confident yet totally tone-deaf bagpipes performance. Ross's absolute, unshakable confidence constantly becomes his own worst enemy, and honestly, that is exactly why we cannot stop laughing at him. If we map out his 3 long-running joke divorces, we see a really clear pattern of poor communication, unresolved emotions, and incredibly impulsive life decisions. First is Carol, which, to be fair, was out of his control. But then comes Emily, a marriage that implodes because he literally says Rachel's name at the altar. There's no way to spin that one. Then comes his totally spontaneous marriage to Rachel after a highly intoxicated night in Las Vegas. These are definitely not the actions of a man carefully thinking through his life choices. It's a timeline of pure, unadulterated chaos.
From Ross's perspective, however, we must pivot, and yes, pun definitely intended there, to look at his redeeming qualities. Because despite all that chaos, his unwavering devotion and loyalty to his core friends are undeniable. Let's look at the breakdown. When Phoebe needs support, he's always there. He talks Chandler down from the ledge before massive life moments. He gives Joey incredibly grounded career advice when he needs it most, and he's a total rock for Monica during her major milestones. He's deeply devoted to his children and his circle. He really isn't selfish all the time.
So rather than viewing him as a one-dimensional villain or some perfect saint, we have to acknowledge that his inconsistencies make him deeply, authentically human. Real people are inconsistent, you know? You can be super generous one day, wildly insecure the next, hilarious the day after that, and just deeply frustrating an hour later. Ross feels authentic because he exists right here in the messy middle, where all of these traits are constantly colliding. If he were perfect, well, he'd be entirely boring. Now, it's also important to remember that audiences have changed. As our cultural conversations around healthy relationships, emotional intelligence, and jealousy have evolved, behaviors that once played solely for laughs in the 1990s now invite much deeper criticism from modern viewers. We tend to judge characters through the values of the time in which we are watching them, not just when they were written. Ross's jealousy and need to be right definitely damage relationships, but at the same time, he was capable of immense loyalty and eventually some real growth. Ultimately, he just wasn't written to be a flawless hero. He was written to be a complicated, messy, everyday person trying to navigate life and love. Which leaves us with a final question that perfectly explains why we're still talking about him, debating him, and laughing at him decades later. Was Ross Geller just a fundamentally flawed friend? Or is his chaotic, insecure, devoted nature exactly what makes him so beautifully human? Take a look at the evidence we've laid out today and decide for yourself. If this explainer gave you a new lens on this classic debate, make sure to stick around because we've got plenty more deep dives into the television characters you thought you knew.